The morning Verity Ashcroft buried her father, she also buried the last of her savings. Not in the coffin, she wasn't that far gone, but between the undertaker's fee and the month of medicinals that hadn't saved him anyway. The tin she kept behind the loose brick in the kitchen was empty by the time she walked home from the churchyard. The village of Hartwell didn't offer much in the way of condolences. A few covered dishes on the step, a nod from Mr. Ferris at the dry goods, and from the county magistrate's clerk, a folded note informing her that her father's print shop, the one her father had built from nothing, the one she had run for the better part of 3 years while he was ill, was now subject to outstanding debts she hadn't known existed. £42, borrowed from a man named Quincy, who hadn't wasted a single day before sending his notice. Verity Ashcroft was 26 years old. She had ink-stained fingers, a very good memory for typeface sizes, and no husband. The last part mattered more than it should have in Hartwell in the year 1814, because a woman alone running a print shop was the sort of thing that made the neighbours talk but not help. She had 2 weeks to pay or surrender the press. She chose to find another way. The notice she posted on the board outside the coaching inn was plain and to the point, because Verity had set enough type in her life to know that words cost something even when the ink is free. She needed a compositor, someone who knew the trade. The wage was modest, she'd been honest about that, and the work was immediate. Anyone with experience setting type, operating a platen press, or binding folios was welcome to inquire at Ashcroft and Daughter on Calloway Lane. She didn't expect much. Hartwell was not a printing town. Most of the men who knew the trade had gone to Bristol or London, where the newspapers were and the wages were real. What she got 2 days later was a man standing in her doorway in a coat that had seen better years. He was tall. That was the first thing she noticed. Too tall for the doorframe, which meant he came in at a slight angle and had probably done so his whole life without thinking about it. Dark hair, not quite combed, hands that were clean, which was more than she could say for the last compositor her father had employed. He held his hat in both hands and looked at the room the way men looked at rooms when they were measuring what kind of trouble they were walking into. "I saw your notice," he said. "I assumed," Verity said. "Can you set type?" "Yes." "Platen press?" "Yes." "Folio binding?" He paused just briefly enough that she noticed. "I can learn it." 2 out of 3 was better than nothing. She looked at him more carefully. He didn't look like a compositor. His posture was wrong, too straight, too still, the kind of stillness that took practice to cultivate. Compositors slouched. They had to. The work demanded it, but she was low on options, and the press didn't run itself. "Your name, Rowe," he said. "Kit Rowe." "Any references, Mr. Rowe?" Another brief pause. "None that are currently accessible," which meant either he was lying or he was running from something or both. Verity thought of the £42. She thought of Quincy's clerk and his folded note. "The wage is 4 shillings a week," she said. "You can sleep in the back room if you've nowhere else. I start at 6 and I stop when the work is done. If you steal from me, I will know before you've reached the end of the lane, because this is a small village and I know everyone in it." Kit Rowe looked at her for a moment. Not quite amusement, not quite respect, something in between. "Understood," he said. "Good." She handed him an apron. "The morning job is a run of 200 broadsheets for the Hartwell Parish Committee. The typeface is Caslin, 11 point. I've already set the frame. I need you to check the spacing on the left column and tell me if the leading looks right to you." He took the apron. He went to the frame. He looked at it for a long moment, and then he said, "The leading is tight on lines 4 through 7. You'll get ink creep on the descenders." Verity Ashcroft had not expected that. She had been running this press for 3 years. She had learned to spot ink creep before it happened. Her father had spotted it faster. The previous compositor had never spotted it at all. Kit Rowe had spotted it in 30 seconds. "Fix it," she said, and went to start the ink. The days settled into a rhythm that Verity hadn't expected to find comfortable. She was not, by nature, a person who found other people's company comfortable. Her father had been the talker. He could hold a conversation with anyone from the bishop to the dung cart driver and find something worth saying. Verity had inherited his eye for type and his stubbornness, but not his ease with people. She was better with words on a page than words spoken aloud. The shop had suited her precisely because it was mostly quiet work. Kit Rowe was, to her surprise, also quiet. He didn't ask questions she hadn't invited. He didn't offer opinions about the work unless she asked, and when she asked, they were worth hearing. He learned the folio binding faster than she'd expected, not perfectly, not at first, but he paid attention in a way that made her wonder where he'd developed the habit. Most men who came to trade work came with habits already fixed. He came as though he was genuinely trying to understand the thing itself, not just execute a task. On the fourth day, she came downstairs at 5:30 to find him already at the press, running off a test sheet for the church registry job that was due Friday. He hadn't been asked. He had simply assessed what needed doing and done it. She stood in the doorway for a moment before he heard her. In that moment, she noticed things she had been trying not to notice. The way he moved around the press, careful but not tentative. The ink on his forearms, which he hadn't bothered to scrub off before the morning started. The fact that he sang very softly under his breath while he worked. Something old and half familiar she couldn't quite name. Then he heard her step and stopped. "The church registry," she said, to have something to say. 200 copies. I thought I'd get ahead of it. "The font," she said, looking at the test sheet. "You used Baskerville. Your father's notes say he used Baskerville for all parish work." I found the ledger. He held up the test sheet. "If you'd prefer something else." "No," Verity said. "Baskerville is right." She took the sheet from him. The print was even, clean, the margins perfectly balanced. She turned it over in her hands. "Where did you train?" she asked. The pause again. She was beginning to recognize the shape of his pauses. They weren't the pauses of a man searching for an answer. They were the pauses of a man deciding how much of a true answer to give. "London," he said. "Some years ago." "Which house?" "A small one. You wouldn't know it." She looked at him steadily. He met her gaze without flinching, which most people didn't manage. "All right," she said, and handed him back the test sheet. "Run the full job." She went to start the kettle. She told herself she didn't care where he'd trained. What mattered was the work, and the work was good. She almost believed it. The trouble with £42 is that it didn't get smaller on its own. Verity had been working the numbers every night, after she shuttered the shop and climbed the narrow stairs to the rooms above that smelled of her father's pipe tobacco and old paper. 4 shillings a week in wages. The cost of ink, of paper stock, of the new roller she'd had to order from Bristol because the old one had cracked in February and her father had kept patching it. The parish jobs paid steadily but not generously. She needed something larger. On the 10th day after Kit Rowe arrived, she got it. A letter from Alderton Brothers in Bristol, one of the larger commercial printers in the region, informing her that they were aware Ashcroft and Daughter was still operating and asking whether she would be interested in a subcontract. They had more broadsheet work than their presses could handle. The pay was per run, better than parish rates. The catch was the deadline. Everything had to be delivered in Bristol by the end of the month. Verity sat with the letter for a long time. The end of the month was 3 weeks away. She would need to run the press almost every day, which meant a compositor who could work at pace. She looked across the shop to where Kit Rowe was cleaning the type blocks with the systematic attention he gave to everything, and she thought, maybe. She brought the letter to him. He read it carefully. She watched his eyes move across the page and noticed, not for the first time, that he read the way educated people read, not just tracking words, but taking them in at a glance, whole sentences at once. "It's manageable," he said. "If we run double shifts on the first 2 weeks." "We," she said. He looked up. "If you're willing to work the same hours you'd ask of me, yes." "We." There was something in that word that she didn't entirely know what to do with. She had been "we" once, with her father in this shop before the illness took his steadiness from his hands, and then the rest of him. She hadn't expected to hear it from a stranger who'd been sleeping in her back room for 10 days. "I'll match your hours," she said. "Starting tomorrow." He nodded and went back to the type blocks. Verity folded the letter and put it in her apron pocket, and did not think about his hands, which were careful and steady, or the way he'd said "we" like it was a matter of simple fact. The days that followed were the hardest and strangest of her life, and she had buried her father 3 weeks before, so that was saying something. They worked from 5 in the morning until past dark. The press ran continuously. Verity set type until her fingers ached and then set more. Kit Rowe ran the platen, checked the impressions, restacked the paper feed, and somewhere in the middle of all of it learned to anticipate her needs before she'd voiced them. A fresh ink roll left at her elbow, the next frame already locked when she turned around. On the third night of this, exhausted and sitting on the floor of the shop eating bread and cold bacon, because neither of them had thought to stop for supper, Verity said something she hadn't intended to. "Why are you here?" He looked at her from across the room. He had his back against the press and was eating his own bread with the focused attention he gave everything. "You hired me," he said. "I know I hired you. I mean here. Hartwell. Why does a man with your—" She gestured at him, at the hands and the reading and the general quality of attention that she couldn't quite name. "Why does a man like you end up answering a compositor's notice in a village like this?" He was quiet for a long time, long enough that she thought he wouldn't answer. "I needed somewhere to be," he said at last. "That wasn't where I was." She thought about that. It was honest, she decided, or at least it was a piece of honesty, which was more than she'd given herself credit for getting from him. "Did you do something wrong?" she asked. "No," he said it without the pause. That was how she knew it was true. "I didn't do anything wrong. I just stopped being able to be in that life." For a while, Verity thought of what that might mean. She decided not to push it. She had her own versions of the same thing. The 3 years she'd spent watching her father shrink. The life in London she'd deferred for one more season, and then another until it stopped being deferred and simply stopped being possible. "The bread's dry," she said. "I'll bring better tomorrow." "It's fine," he said. "I've had worse." "So have I," she said, and they finished their supper in the kind of silence that doesn't require filling. She found out by accident, which was probably the only way she would have found out at all. It was the 22nd day. They were 5 days ahead of the Alderton brothers' deadline, which meant for the first time since his arrival she had an afternoon, without urgency pressing on her, from every direction. She sent Kit Rowe to collect a paper delivery from the coaching inn, because her back hurt, and she didn't want to carry it herself, and she stayed in the shop and reorganized the typeface drawers, which had been in disorder since before her father's illness. A man came into the shop while she was working, not from Hartwell. She would have known him. He was dressed well, travel-worn, and he looked around the shop with the expression of someone who hadn't expected what they were looking at. "I'm looking for someone," he said. "I was told he might have passed through Hartwell. Lots of people pass through Hartwell," Verity said without turning from the drawers. "The coaching inn would know better than I would. He's a tall man, dark-haired, quiet at sort." Verity's hands stilled on the typeface drawer. "He goes by different names sometimes," the man continued, "but his real name is Christopher Aldenmere, the Marquess of Aldenmere. He's been missing from his estate for 6 weeks, and his family is rather urgently looking for him." Verity put down the typeface she was holding very carefully. The Marquess of Aldenmere, she knew the name. Everyone in England who read a newspaper knew the name. One of the oldest titles in the country, an estate in Shropshire, a seat in the Lords. She had, in fact, set type about the Aldenmere family several times. A death notice for the previous Marquess 3 years ago, an announcement of the current one succeeding to the title. She turned around slowly. "I'm afraid I can't help you," she said. "We don't get many Marquesses in Hartwell." The man looked at her carefully. She met his eyes and didn't blink, because she had her father's stubbornness if nothing else. He left 5 minutes later. Verity stood in the empty shop and thought for a very long moment about who she was and what she owed and what was right. Then she went back to the typeface drawers and waited. Kit came back with the paper delivery. He set it down. He looked at her face and went very still. "Someone came," she said. It wasn't a question. He knew from her voice that it wasn't. He put his hat on the table and sat down in the chair across from the press and said nothing. "Christopher Aldenmere," Verity said. "The Marquess of Aldenmere." The silence stretched. She watched him go through something she didn't entirely have words for. Not quite relief, not quite dread, something more complicated than either. "Yes," he said. One word. But he said it the same way he'd said no when she'd asked if he'd done something wrong, without the pause, without the hedging, like the truth was the only thing that made sense anymore. "You lied to me," she said. "I told you my name was Kit Rowe." "Kit," she said flatly. "Christopher. Kit. I haven't been called Kit since I was 12, but it's still mine." He looked at his hands. "Rowe is my mother's maiden name. I didn't lie about the printing either. I learned it at Oxford. There was a press in the college, run by an old man named Gidding, who thought every gentleman ought to know a practical trade. I spent 2 years there. I wasn't lying about that. But you were lying about everything else." "I was omitting," he said. "There's a difference." "There isn't," Verity said. "When the thing omitted is the fact that you're one of the highest-ranking peers in England, and I've been paying you 4 shillings a week to sleep in my back room." Something crossed his face at that. Not quite a smile, or maybe a smile that had gotten complicated somewhere on its way to his mouth. "The 4 shillings weren't necessary," he said. "I would have worked for nothing." "Why?" He looked up at her then. She had been avoiding looking at him directly for 3 weeks. Or rather, she'd been managing how much she let herself look, and now she couldn't quite manage it. And he was watching her with an expression she recognized because it was the same expression she'd felt on her own face and tried to suppress. "Because I needed somewhere that wasn't my life," he said quietly. "And this shop, this work became the place I stopped wanting to leave." The room was very quiet. The press was cold. Somewhere outside, a cart was moving down Calloway Lane. "You have an estate," Verity said. "You have a title and a seat in the Lords and apparently a family that has been searching for you for 6 weeks, yes. And you were going to, what, stay here forever? Set type for parish committees and learn folio binding. I was going to figure out the rest," he said. "I hadn't gotten that far. That is the most." She stopped herself, started again. "You should have told me." "I know. From the very beginning, you should have said, 'I know.'" He met her eyes. "And if I had, would you have given me the apron?" She thought about the morning he'd arrived. The empty tin behind the brick, the £42 and the notice from Quincy's clerk. "No," she said honestly. "I would have thought you were lying about the other things too." "That's why," he said simply. "Not to deceive you, to be just a person for a while." Verity looked at him for a long time. She was very good at reading things. Type blocks, proof sheets, ledger entries, faces. She had been reading Kit Rowe for 3 weeks, and she read him now with everything she had. He wasn't lying. He wasn't performing. He was sitting in her compositor's chair in an ink-stained shirt, exhausted from 3 weeks of double shifts, and he was telling her the truth the only way he knew how to. It didn't make it right. It didn't make it simple. But it was true. "Go eat something," she said finally. "There's soup on the back." He blinked. "That's all?" "No," Verity said, turning back to the typeface drawers. "That's not all. But I need to think, and I can't think while you're sitting there looking at me like that." "Like what?" "Like you're waiting for a verdict." He was quiet for a moment. Then she heard him stand, and heard his steps cross toward the back room, and heard him pause. "Verity," he said. She had not given him leave to use her name. He had used it anyway, somewhere in the 3rd week, and she hadn't corrected him. "The Alderton job," he said. "Let me finish it." "Whatever you decide, let me finish the job. You need the delivery on time." She didn't turn around. "I know I need the delivery on time," she said. "I've needed the delivery on time since before you got here." She heard him go. She thought about it for 4 days. She thought about it while they finished the Alderton job, and while she watched him work, and while she did not watch him work, and while she counted the payment that arrived from Bristol, which was enough to cover Quincy's debt, with £7 left over. She thought about what the neighbour women would say. She thought about what her father would have said, which was probably something dry and useful, because her father had been that kind of man. She thought about what it meant that he had come here, that he had chosen, of all the places in England he could have gone, with all the money and all the houses and all the connections available to a man with that title. He had chosen to answer a compositor's notice in Hartwell, and sleep in a back room, and learn folio binding and split his apron pocket, carrying a ream of paper uphill from the coaching inn. She thought about what it meant that she had let him. On the 5th day she went to find him. He was in the back room, which she had technically let him sleep in, but rarely entered herself. The room held a cot, a small table, a lamp. On the table was a book and a letter, sealed but unaddressed. She didn't ask about the letter. "I've thought about it," she said. He put down the book and waited. "I'm not leaving Hartwell," she said, "and I'm not becoming a Marchioness or going to Shropshire or any of it. This shop is mine. My father built it. I run it. That's not something I'm willing to set aside." Kit Rowe, Christopher Aldenmere, looked at her steadily. "I know," he said. "I'm not finished," Verity said. "I'm also not asking you to stay and keep sleeping in my back room for 4 shillings a week, because that's not right either. That's not what I want." Something very careful moved in his face. "What do you want?" he asked. She had set type for 20,000 words in her life, and still the right ones were hard to find. "I want things to be honest," she said. "I want to know who you actually are. Not Kit Rowe the compositor, not the Marquess of Aldenmere in the newspapers. The actual person who reads entire sentences at a glance and sings under his breath when he thinks nobody's listening and spotted my ink creep in 30 seconds. He was quiet, and then slowly something in him that had been held careful and still for 6 weeks loosened. "His name is Christopher," he said. "He has a younger sister he's avoided for 2 years because she married a man he disapproves of, and he hasn't found the right way to stop disapproving. He has an estate in Shropshire that he loves and has been running badly because he's better at the accounts than the people. He learned to set type from a man named Gidding, who told him that a gentleman who couldn't do a thing with his hands was only half a man. He has been trying to figure out what the other half is supposed to look like." Verity listened to all of this. "That person," she said, "might be welcome in this shop." He looked at her for a long moment. "In what capacity?" he asked carefully. "We'll have to discuss that," Verity said. "You should probably start by writing to your family, because I will not have people searching the county for someone who's standing in my compositor's room. And you should probably also go to Shropshire at some point and deal with the estate and whatever is in that letter on the table." "And when I come back?" he asked. She turned toward the door. Her hand was on the frame. "When you come back," she said, "the Alderton brothers' contract has been renewed. I'll need a compositor for 6 more weeks. The wage is 4 shillings. Verity." She stopped. "I don't want to come back as a compositor," he said. She didn't turn around, but she didn't leave either. "I know," she said. "We'll talk about that when you come back." He wrote the letter to his family that evening. She heard the scratch of his pen from the other side of the wall and didn't intrude. He left on a Tuesday 3 days later, on the morning coach to Shrewsbury. She opened the shop at 6 and did not watch from the window. She went to the typeface drawers and organised the Garamond case, which didn't need it. And then she organised the Baskerville case, which also didn't need it. And then she sat down at the compositing table and held a single type block in her fingers for a while without setting it. The shop was very quiet without him. She had not realised how much quieter it had been before. He came back in 3 weeks. She heard the coaching indoor, heard the familiar sound of someone who was too tall to avoid the low beam above the shop entrance coming in at an angle, and didn't look up from the frame she was setting. "The Alderton renewal came through," she said. 250 this run." "Good," Kit said, hanging his coat on the peg by the door. "There's a new apron. The old one fell apart. I'll take it. The folio binding project is behind. The account from Whitmore's has to go out by Friday. I'll start on it now." She heard him tie the apron strings. She heard him move to the supply table. She heard him take a stack of folios and sit down at the long bench and begin to work, with the same quiet, systematic attention he'd brought to everything from the first morning. She kept setting type. The room filled with the small sounds of the press, the creak of the bench, the soft knock of a folio cover being fitted, the rhythm of 2 people working in the same space. She set lines 4 through 7 of the morning frame and checked the leading. It was right. It had always been right when he checked it first. After a while she said, without looking up, "Your sister." "We spoke," Kit said. "It was difficult and better than I expected, both at once. That's usually how those things go. I'm aware of that now." A pause. The folio binding continued. "The estate," she said, "is in better shape than I'd feared. I have a good steward. I'd just been avoiding going to see for myself." "Why?" He was quiet for a moment. "Because it felt like going back to something I'd stopped knowing how to be." Verity thought about that. "And now?" she asked. "Now," he said slowly, "I think it's possible to be more than one thing, to have the estate and the title and also This, if this is something that wants to be had. She set the last botlock in the morning frame, locked the chase, ran her fingers across the type, checking for loose pieces. Everything was even. Everything was set. She turned around. Kit Rowe, Christopher Aldenmere, was looking at her from across the shop in the morning light, coming through the single window, ink already on his hands, apron already slightly crooked, with the expression she had learned to read over 3 weeks of double shifts and cold bacon eaten on the floor. "I'm not a marchioness," she said. "I know. I'll never be one. It's not who I am. I know that too, but," she said carefully, "I am a printer. And printers have always needed patrons, and patrons have always needed printers, and historically that relationship has worked out reasonably well for both parties." Something shifted in his face. Not quite a smile. Something warmer. "Historically," he said. "Don't push it," Verity said. "Fix the Whitmore folios. We'll talk about the rest of it when we're not behind on a deadline." He turned back to the folios. She turned back to the press. Outside, Calloway Lane was waking up. The cart horse from Ferris's stable, the distant clang of the smithy, the ordinary sounds of Hartwell at 7 in the morning. Inside, the press was warm, and the type was set, and there were 250 broadsheets to run before Friday. And for the first time in a long time, Verity Ashcroft felt certain she had exactly enough of what she needed.